Sometimes things don't fall apart with a bang, don't crumble under the weight of big words or dramatic gestures. Sometimes all it takes for the world to crack is one sentence, said in just the wrong tone, to the wrong person, at the wrong time. In our case, that person was a 7-year-old girl who simply wanted to talk about her school project, to show that she cared, that she'd tried. It all happened on an evening that was no different from hundreds of others, except that I felt a slight fatigue mixed with the familiar feeling of domestic routine. I was cooking dinner, our version of a regular meal, as Noemi, my mother-in-law, called it, sitting at the table and commenting on my every move as if I were still a student in cooking class and not a woman who had lived with her son for over 10 years. And before we continue, I want to thank you. I'm so glad you're watching this video on my channel. Please let me know in the comments if you remember someone in your life when you listen to these stories, maybe yourself, someone close to you, or just a moment when everything suddenly changed. Tell me what came to mind first. Filippo, as always, sat with his phone, scrolling through his endless news feed, as if that's where his real life was happening. Beatrice, my little girl, chattered incessantly, cheerful, bright, and too loud for this house, where loud noises irritated her mother-in-law and a child's liveliness was considered a sign of poor parenting. We sat down to dinner, me, trying not to think about the slightly dry meat, Noemi, with her eternally judgmental gaze, and Filippo, indifferent to everything going on. Beatrice, her eyes shining, began to tell how their teacher had read Pushkin's poems to the children, and how she herself had decided to learn one of them to recite at home. But just as she excitedly interrupted her grandmother, trying to get a word in edgewise, everything suddenly stopped. Noemi set down her fork with a sharp clang, as if she had shot a bullet into the silence, and stood up, straight as a ship's mast, cold as ice. You've been naughty today, she said evenly, without emotion, but with that special force that doesn't require shouting. No dinner, straight to bed. The room grew so quiet that I heard Beatrice catch her breath. Her eyes, huge and shining, looked at her grandmother not with resentment or anger, rather with the stunned feeling of someone suddenly deprived of support. All she wanted was to share the poem. She didn't even understand what she'd done wrong. I looked up at Filippo. He wasn't looking at me, he was just slowly picking at his potatoes with his fork, as if nothing had happened, as if this was all a small thing, a family incident unworthy of intervention, as if his mother had not only punished the child but also deprived our daughter of her voice. Go to your room, no arguing, Noemi added, her voice ringing in my ears like an order. She always spoke as if she were addressing not living people, but subordinates at a parade. I felt a wave rise inside me, not even rage, but something deeper, dull, hot, almost animalistic, but on the outside, I remained motionless, stone. I slowly folded my napkin, as if performing a ritual, and stood up. I walked over to my daughter and took her hand, small, warm, trembling. We've already eaten dinner, I said calmly, too calmly for it to be unnoticeable. Thank you, let's go, dear. Beatrice stood up without a word and followed me. Behind me, the silence was so thick, it was as if the house had stopped breathing for a second. Even Noemi seemed surprised that I would leave like that, without arguing or shouting. Upstairs, I asked Beatrice to change, and she nodded obediently. Her eyes were already dry, but her gaze remained surprised, uncomprehending. While she fiddled with her pajamas, I opened the closet and pulled out an old suitcase, hidden between coats and boxes of winter scarves. One suitcase, not heavy. I knew what I was putting in there: essentials, documents, a few clothes, a tablet, chargers, and a folder of printed letters and receipts that I'd started collecting a month ago, just in case. After a while, Filippo knocked on the door. Are you serious? He asked, without entering, his voice muffled, as if through a forest. It was just dinner. She was acting like a hooligan. Mom's not wrong. I didn't answer. If he really thought differently, he would have said so there, at the table, but now it was too late. I walked past him silently, not looking him in the eye. I left the spare key on the kitchen table. I put on my coat and zipped up Beatrice, feeling my fingers tremble. It all happened like a dream, as if it weren't happening to me, but to some other woman who had finally decided to play the role destined for her, a strong role, even though she herself was barely breathing from fear. 10 minutes later, we were standing by the side of the road, illuminated by the few streetlights, their dim circles of light swaying on the wet asphalt like the breath of a city tired and indifferent to our fates. I held Beatrice in one arm, her whole body pressed against mine, warm and trembling, like a small animal who doesn't understand what's happened but senses that the world has suddenly become different. In the other hand, I held a suitcase, heavy not with things, but with the weight of our entire former lives inside it, folded neatly, like old clothes I couldn't get rid of. Chloe drove up quickly, the headlights softly illuminating us, and I saw her face, wary but without a single unnecessary question. She got out of the car and hugged me, briefly, tightly, the way only those who don't need explanations can. Chloe knew, not everything, but enough to simply say, "Get in, let's go." The car was silent, broken only by the sound of rain on the glass and Beatrice's soft breathing. In the back seat, a few minutes later, she whispered without raising her head, "Mom, was I really bad?" Her voice was so quiet I almost didn't hear her, but the words cut into my chest like a knife. I turned to her and took her hand. "No, honey," I said, "you were wonderful. It's just that some adults forget what it's like to be a child, how painful it is to be silenced just because you're too happy." She nodded, smiled faintly, and I saw a flicker of relief cross her face, but it lasted only a moment, like a ray of sunlight sliding across water and vanishing. Anita, Chloe's friend, let us stay in her guest room. It smelled of lavender and fresh linens, and this simple thought, a clean pillow, a glass of water by the bed, felt like a gift, a luxury I hadn't felt in a long time. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the floor, leaning against the bed, among the spread-out papers, the laptop, and neat stacks of receipts. I worked quietly, mechanically, almost without thinking. Like a surgeon performing long-practiced movements, I sorted through bank statements, reviewed contracts, downloaded old files with payment documents, systematized everything, extra staff payments for the past 2 years, bills for groceries, clothing, school, children's activities, letters from teachers and clients, everything that proved my existence, my contribution, my invisible but constant work. Filippo lost his job 2 years ago and was never able to return either to the business or, frankly, to himself. Since then, we've lived on my earnings, my persistence, my fear of losing everything. But in that house, I remained a shadow, tolerated but unnecessary, present only because someone had to cook soup, iron shirts, and keep quiet. Now I was becoming different, documented, real, dangerous because I had proof. 2 days later, I sat across from a family lawyer. He leafed through my files slowly, meticulously, with the attention a man pays to a map before a long journey. When he looked up, his voice was calm, but respectful. "You have a point," he said, "a compelling one, even more compelling than most." I smiled slightly, tired but firm. "I'm not trying to destroy anyone, I just want my daughter to have a home, a real one, where no one belittles her for simply being there." He nodded. "Then let's do everything we can to make sure you get it." People will say later, "Oh, come on, it was just dinner, just my strict grandmother." But I knew it wasn't one moment, not one evening. This was the last time after hundreds of previous ones, after months of silence. Resentment, invisible cuts that leave scars even when no one sees them. I didn't scream, didn't slam doors, didn't break dishes. I simply left, but it wasn't running away. I didn't retreat, I returned, to myself, to my daughter, to the right that belongs to every person, to be heard. And that's when it all really began. Beatrice fell asleep, curled up on the sofa, her fingers still clutching my sleeve, as if even in her sleep she feared I would disappear. I sat next to her, motionless, as if I had become part of the furniture. My gaze was fixed on the ceiling, but inside I saw only the past, the very place where everything began to fall apart, slowly, almost imperceptibly, long before this dinner, when I first stopped believing that home could be a place where you were loved and not judged. "Just a couple of months," Filippo said then, as if it were a trivial matter, a temporary setback, almost a joke. His voice was confident, though his eyes betrayed the weariness that's impossible to hide, the kind of weariness that comes when someone's still pretending but has given up on the inside. "Until I find a new job, we can't keep paying rent. you know that, he added, and I nodded. Of course I knew. He'd been unemployed for 2 months now, and those 2 months dragged on like an eternity, weaving into our conversations, into the nights when I fell asleep with my laptop on my lap, and into our morning coffees when he sat silently staring out the window. I'd been working all that time, freelancing, copywriting, translations, marketing, content, website copy, writing articles about things I didn't care about but that brought in money. It wasn't mind-blowing, but it was enough to live on, peacefully. Enough, if only we could remain a team. Couldn't we just move in with your mom? I asked softly, trying to sound less like an accusation and more like a doubt, an attempt to maintain my dignity. We're adults, we have a child, he grinned, with that lazy condescension he always showed when he wanted to make a point. Exactly, we have a child, Mom has a huge house, she'll be happy to help, and, as if that explanation were enough, he returned to his phone, and I to my thoughts, where everything revolved around one question. Who should I help, him, us, or her? For the first 3 days, Noemi was genuinely happy. She greeted us with a smile, bustling about like the heroine of one of those old Sunday movies. She hung new curtains in Beatrice's room, baked an apple pie, arranged flowers in vases. I tried to be grateful, I really did. I wanted to be wrong about her, wanted to believe that maybe I'd simply misunderstood her all these years, that her coldness was a defense, not a weapon. But by the end of the first week, she was already teaching me how to make my beds properly, and doing so as if I were violating a sacred family ritual. By the second week, she was rearranging my pots in the kitchen, saying loudly enough for everyone to hear, "This isn't a student dorm, we're supposed to keep things tidy here." I smiled, at first, then I stopped. By the end of the first month, she was already explaining to Beatrice that girls don't behave like that at Grandma's house, while my daughter quietly hummed along to a song on her tablet. That was the first time I felt something tighten inside, like I couldn't breathe, even though the windows were open. During the day, I worked discreetly, and at night, I sat late at my laptop, writing, translating documents, and searching for new clients to cover bills, pay for school, clothes, and groceries. Noemi drove Beatrice to school and cleaned, but she did it with a demonstrative sternness that felt more like a stage play, as if her every breath were part of a drama called "Look How I Sacrifice Myself." Filippo, meanwhile, sank deeper into his chair, idly scrolling through job postings, but more often than not, he simply played PlayStation when reality became too much. He gradually disappeared, first from conversations, then from everyday details, and finally from our team. Sometimes, at dinner, I felt out of place, like an observer in my own home. Filippo, Noemi, and this house formed a trinity in which I had no place. 6 months passed, and the roof started leaking. A dark streak of dampness appeared in the corner of the bedroom, and mold in the bathroom. I stood there with a bucket in my hands, and Filippo merely sighed. "We probably need to do something, but we can't afford it." And I realized, "we" in his mouth had long since meant only me. I hired a contractor, paid from my own account, without a word. He didn't even ask how much it cost. After all, this wasn't our home, but I was the one renovating it. I painted the walls, bought new towels, washed the floors, as if trying to erase the traces of rejection, and yet, every breath in this house whispered, "You don't belong here." Filippo's father had died a year earlier, when we were still living in our apartment. Back then, I saw him cry, how for the first time in many years he became softer, more human. Back then, I thought grief would bring us closer, but then everything changed. The house went to Noemi, and she and Filippo divided it in half. I didn't interfere, didn't ask, didn't demand, I simply accepted. And then, one evening, as I sat in the kitchen, he said casually, without looking up from his laptop, "Mom's lawyer registered the title. Now the house is officially in her and my name." I blinked, not immediately understanding. "And me?" I asked. He shrugged, as if it were some formality. "You're not there, it's not ours, it's mine." And in that moment, I felt the word "our" cease to exist, as if it had been erased from our lives along with me. One afternoon, I tried to turn on the washing machine. It seemed like a small thing, a simple movement. Press a button, hear the familiar hum, smell the detergent, cleanliness. and routine, but the machine didn't turn on. I tried again, silence, a message flashed on the display about an invalid code, then I realized Noemi had changed the lock, just like that, without explanation, without warning. When I asked politely, trying not to appear confused, she answered with the cool evenness she mastered to perfection, "You're charging it incorrectly, I don't want you to ruin the machine," and something in me seemed to snap at that moment, as if she had reached out and invisibly flicked a switch, cutting me off completely from this life. It wasn't about the washing machine, of course, or the code, it was about power, about her certainty that I was now a nobody. Even the laundry I washed for my daughter no longer belonged to me. I went to the bathroom and cried quietly, looking at my reflection in the mirror, a face I suddenly no longer trusted, eyes that no longer recognized themselves. I cried silently, so Beatrice wouldn't hear. By then, I was no longer a wife or a mother in this house. I had become a shadow, a creature tolerated but unwanted, a woman who should be grateful simply to be allowed to remain close to her child. Filippo never took my side. "Come on," he'd say, "it's just Mom, you take everything too seriously." His words sounded tired, but they always held a hint of irritation, as if my pain were an inconvenience disturbing his peace. And once, he said it to me directly, looking me in the eye, "You're acting like a guest," and I thought, yes, perhaps this is exactly how I feel, a guest. A random woman who found herself in a place she shouldn't be. That night, for the first time, I thought, what if I just leave? The thought felt both dangerous and liberating, but leaving wasn't easy, not with a child, not without money, without support, without a roof over my head. I imagined them saying, "She abandoned her daughter," or "She's unstable, depressed, hysterical." At worst, they'd try to prove I was incompetent, that Beatrice would be better off with them, with their home, with their order. I knew how quickly stories turn against women, especially when all you have is the truth, and even that without witnesses. So I waited, and prepared. I created a folder on my laptop, a simple one, with a neutral name, so no one would guess. Everything went there: school receipts, emails from teachers, medical certificates, bank statements, checks, bills, notes, anything that could show that I wasn't a random figure, not a passing shadow, but a mother. A pillar, the person who kept this house afloat while others pretended life went on as usual. Filippo hadn't worked for over a year and a half. Everything Beatrice ate and wore, everything she played with, everything she studied, even her Christmas presents, it all came from me. Every penny, every little thing, every purchase was my responsibility, my effort. But in this house, they still said he was the head of the family. He sat at the head of the table, making decisions that didn't exist, feigning importance. And I watched, feeling a quiet contempt grow within me, cold, stubborn, inevitable. One night, after all this, there was a sudden knock on the door. The present returned like a sharp inhalation, a voice behind the door, "Chloe, Sarah, are you awake?" I looked up from my papers. Papers were everywhere: the table, the sofa, the windowsill, like traces of my inner work, my struggle. I opened the door. Chloe was standing with a teapot and 2 mugs. "How's Beatrice?" she asked. "Asleep," I answered, my voice shaking. She entered, looked around the room, saw printouts, spreadsheets, neat stacks of papers. "You kept all this?" she asked quietly. I nodded. 2 years, I said. Chloe sat down on the edge of the sofa, put her mug on the floor, and sighed. "You're incredible, Sarah," she said after a pause. "But listen, you don't have to bear this alone. You're not alone anymore, and you don't have to endure another day of this crap." I looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a little better, not from words, but from the fact that someone nearby understood without explanation. My voice was quiet but firm. "I won't go into the unknown, and I won't leave empty-handed," I said. "They think I'm broke, but they've forgotten who I am. I'm a mother, and now I won't wait any longer." I didn't raise my voice, but every word carried the calm that comes after a storm, when the sea no longer rages, but its depths frighten it. Filippo received the divorce notice on Friday. And that same evening, a storm began, not the kind with wind and rain, but a different kind, human, thick, sticky, with shouts on the phone and words that make the air thicker. First came the calls. I knew it would happen, That's what always happens when a building collapses where everyone has grown accustomed to living on your back. I'd already turned off my phone, not because I wanted to hide, no. Just so I wouldn't have to flinch every 10 seconds from the vibration, like my heart was beating. An alarm from within, it rang 6 times in a row, insistently, with the desperate stubbornness of a person who realizes for the first time that they no longer have control over the situation. Then the first message arrived. I read it slowly, as if it were someone else's text, not believing these words were addressed to me. Are you crazy? Who do you think you are? Do you think you can just walk away and tear off your piece, as if none of this matters? This is my home, my inheritance, you've only got character. I closed the screen and buried my face in my hands for a moment. Everything was going exactly as expected. They never believed I'd take the plunge. They always thought I was too tired, too obedient, too afraid, and now they couldn't believe I'd actually done it, chosen myself. A few hours later, Noemi wrote. Her tone was so hurt, as if I'd stolen the family jewels straight from her jewelry box. Not filed for divorce. You ruined everything. You lived in our house for free, ate our food, used our water, our electricity. We took you in, and this is how you repay us. You destroyed our family, and now you want money? I reread the message once, then again, and what rose up inside me wasn't indignation, it was weariness, a strange, cold calm. When you realize, evidence speaks louder than words. I wondered what she would say when she saw all the receipts, bank transfers, and income statements. For 2 years, I'd paid everything, every check, every bill, and now they were talking about me like I was a parasite. The next day, the calls from an unknown number began. I didn't answer the first time, the second time, too. On the third, I recognized the voice, though I rarely heard it. Maria, Filippo's cousin, the one who sends a Christmas card every December wishing her happiness and the inevitable phrase, "Things aren't the same anymore." Her voice was awkward, ingratiating, as if she were afraid to offend. "Hi, Sarah," she began. "I heard something. I know it's none of my business, but are you sure you want to go through all this? Divorce lawyers, court, is it worth it?" I listened without interrupting, feeling the familiar weariness creeping back into my shoulders. "Yes," I said calmly, "it's worth it." She hesitated, then exhaled. "It's just that Filippo says you were on edge. He's worried, he says you're unstable, he's afraid for Beatrice." I clutched the phone tighter, as if I could squeeze the lie out of the plastic. "Tell Filippo," I said slowly, each word like a stone, "that I'm worried about Beatrice, because he hasn't worked for 2 years, hasn't paid for a single textbook, hasn't once asked how she's feeling, and hasn't even looked her in the eye at dinner." Maria fell silent, confused. "Well, I didn't mean it that way. Don't take it literally," she muttered. "How else?" I replied quietly. The silence fell, and then she simply hung up. And so it all began, the campaign, not furious, not fast, sluggish, but sneaky, like poisonous dew that gradually permeates everything. Filippo told mutual friends that I'd lost my temper, that I had anger issues, that I was preventing him from seeing his daughter. And now, whenever I logged onto social media, the eyes I saw weren't curiosity, but doubt. One man, once a mutual acquaintance, sent me a private message. "Hey, is it true you're not letting Filippo see Beatrice? He said you're threatening him." I didn't respond. I just took a screenshot and added it to a folder, an archive of screenshots. Each message was like a puzzle piece, fitting together to form a coherent picture. This wasn't just a divorce anymore, it had become stalking. They didn't like the fact that I didn't play along, didn't make excuses, didn't defend myself. Silence was more unbearable for them than screaming, and I simply collected evidence, one file after another, like a soldier sorting through his ammunition before his final battle. My lawyer remained calm. His certainty was almost unbearable in its cold logic, but I clung to it like an anchor. "They hope to frighten you, to force you to retreat," he said, "but we don't react, we act. They have emotions, and you have evidence, and that's all that matters." "They'll claim the house isn't mine," I said, and I heard my own voice as if from somewhere else, calm but stubborn, devoid of tremor, like a blade finally taking shape. My lawyer looked up from his papers and nodded, taking his time answering, as if this were no longer a drama but a chess game. the moves calculated in advance. Yes, legally, the property did belong to Noemi and Filippo, inherited property, family property, sacred in their eyes, but he slowly flipped through the folder, the rustling of the pages like the breath of logic itself. You were married when he received his share, he said calmly. You lived in this house for 2 years, not as a guest, but as a spouse, as the mother of his child, as the person who essentially maintained the house. You paid the bills, the repairs, the maintenance, you contributed financially, and most importantly, we have the documents. He pulled out printouts on the table. Bills for roof repairs, receipts for plumbing, window replacements, electrician's work, for everything done with my money, with my cards, with my hands. Filippo didn't lift a finger. The lawyer said, without looking up, this isn't about taking over the house, we're asking for fair compensation. Your contributions are part of the joint property, the court will understand. The court doesn't listen to emotions, it looks at the numbers, and the numbers are on your side. I nodded. There was still that same crushing feeling in my chest, as if someone was holding a stone there, but beneath it, deeper, a sudden peace appeared, strange, thick, like the air before a deep breath, when you know a storm is coming, but you're no longer afraid of getting wet. A week later, Filippo filed for temporary guardianship. His lawyer did it informally, hastily, as if for the sake of it, a pressure tactic, an attempt to force me to make concessions. He wants to see his daughter, my lawyer said, forwarding the documents to me. I read them silently, then dictated a response. Beatrice is not a pawn. If he wants to see her, let him do so through official channels, in a neutral setting, with the written consent of both parties. Everything must be documented, no emotion, no scenes, just order and fact. The reply came quickly, almost instantly, like a slap in the face. Your anger is ruining everything. She will hate you for this when she grows up. I didn't reread it, I simply deleted it. I no longer spoke to him directly. Everything went through the lawyer. That evening, I gathered another batch of documents, 2 years' worth of tax returns, utility bills, grocery receipts, clothing receipts, school fees, extracurricular expenses, medical certificates, even a printout of Beatrice's school report card, where the teacher had left a note. She's an attentive, thoughtful girl, and it's clear she's well attended at home. I added a testimonial from a longtime client, letters from Chloe confirming that Filippo hadn't been involved in either the child's upbringing or her home life. This wasn't just a collection of papers, it was armor, a bronze shell woven from facts, from details, from those unnoticeable steps with which I'd kept the house afloat for so many years. Documents don't scream, they don't plead or justify themselves. They simply exist, and their silence speaks louder than any accusation. This is what really happened. A few days later, my lawyer called with an unexpected note in his voice, not joy, no, but the kind of reserved satisfaction a doctor has when his treatment is finally working. Something's changed, he said. They've started vacillating. Too many facts, too few counterarguments. Their position is falling apart. I felt something inside me shift slightly, not elation, more like a quiet confirmation. Yes, it had all been worth it. He added that Noemi was rumored to be furious. They say she's pacing the house like a cloud, breaking her nails on doorknobs, accusing everyone around her of betraying him. Filippo, according to the lawyer, is waving his arms and yelling like a man who's realized for the first time that his words no longer work. And then, a couple of days later, the first real sign came, a letter from their lawyer, dry, businesslike, without the usual jabs. What amount of compensation would your client consider acceptable for an out-of-court settlement? My lawyer merely chuckled softly. They realize they're losing, he said. They need to save face, let them think it was their idea. I sat at Anita's kitchen table, the coffee cooling in my mug, a stack of printed documents lying on the table between us. My personal scar, transformed into paper. My phone vibrated, a message, from Filippo. I opened it and read it slowly, word by word, as if trying it on from memory. You've humiliated me, all of us. You want money, you'll lose Beatrice. I'll prove you're unstable, you're nothing. You've always been nothing. I stared at the screen and suddenly felt the corners of my lips lift. A smile came of its own accord, without anger, without triumph. Because in that moment I realized, If I truly were a nobody, he wouldn't have had to try so desperately to erase me from his memory. They tried to hold on, with all their might, maintaining a semblance of dignity and control, as if order and not chaos still reigned in their home, but I already knew it was only a thin shell concealing fear. For several days, there was complete radio silence, wary, viscous, like the silence before a storm, when you hear no footsteps, no phone calls, no new letters, only your own breathing and anticipation. And then, as expected, they changed tactics, the same old, time-worn strategy, where accusations replace arguments, where the truth is distorted beyond recognition, where every word becomes a weapon. Filippo called my former manager, the same one I hadn't spoken to in a year, and, as it turned out, with his characteristic meanness, he hinted, "Had you noticed her mood swings? Did she seem unstable to you?" Maybe she was on something. The manager listened, and then, as he later told me, simply hung up without even answering. I didn't need an explanation. I knew that gesture of his, sharp, proud, like that of a man disgusted by lies. But it didn't end there. They started writing to Beatrice's school, anonymous letters, complaints, supposedly from concerned parents, with the vile implication that their child might be living in an unsafe environment. I read these letters and felt not fear, but something else, repulsion, the sickening realization that they were willing to step over even a child's head just to make me flinch. I brought everything to my lawyer. He glanced at me, nodded once, and said, "Panic, that's a good sign." And in those two words, oddly enough, I found relief. A week later, Jason, the family's lawyer, called, the same one who always spoke in a calm, controlled voice, as if he measured each word with a ruler. "Sarah, good afternoon," he said, his tone filled with the cool respect that comes when one side acknowledges the other's strength. "I wanted to discuss the possibility of a settlement. We've reviewed your materials. Let's just say we've concluded that dragging out the process isn't practical." I sat in the living room, holding the phone to my ear and listening to his voice, the thought ringing loudly in my head. They understood everything. They saw the whole picture. They knew I wasn't bluffing. "We're prepared to offer compensation," he continued, "in exchange for a complete waiver of any property claims." "Of course, this isn't a confession, Jason," I interrupted. "The amount I'm willing to accept is $120,000. In exchange, I waive any rights to Filippo's share of the house. Everything must be notarized, and the matter is closed." There was a pause, just one short breath, like the sound of a door opening, and then a calm voice. "I'll inform my clients. I think they'll agree." Later, Chloe told me how that evening at their house had gone. She knew from a mutual friend that Noemi had screamed so loudly that it could be heard through the garden, that she'd grabbed the armrest of the chair, shouting, "I'd rather burn this money than give her a cent." Filippo, they said, sat nearby, his gaze blank, as if he hadn't heard anything, as if everything was just background noise to his inner emptiness. Their lawyer spoke softly, evenly, almost paternally. "If you don't agree to a settlement, the case will go to trial, then a financial audit will be scheduled, Beatrice's school will be called to testify, the judge will examine your expenses, your stake in the property, and may order you to pay more, restructure the house, or even sell part of it, which will inevitably reduce the value." "It's a risk," he said calmly, and the word, spoken without emphasis, seemed to hang in the air, leaving Noemi speechless. "You'll lose more," he added, "and everything will become public knowledge." And so it was. Public shame for Noemi was more terrible than any financial loss. Her pride, her desire to be seen as the perfect housewife, the ideal heiress, wife, and mother, none of it would stand the test of time. The next day, I received a short letter from Jason. The amount had been approved, payment was due within 10 business days, and the agreement was subject to notarization. I remember that day vividly, like a frame shot on old film. I sat at the bank, at a long oak table, my lawyer beside me, silent, attentive, confident. The notary leafed through the pages, checking signatures, the paper rustling like the wings of a tired bird. Everything was quiet, almost sacred in its formality. As I signed the last page, my hand trembled, and somewhere deep inside, a strange thrill flickered, as if part of me was still waiting for someone to burst into the room and shout, "Stop! We've changed our minds." But no one did. The notary stamped the form, the lawyer nodded, and the documents were handed over. The money arrived in the account 2 days later, $120,000, exactly the amount I'd named. This wasn't revenge, it was compensation for his silence. For the fear, for the sleepless nights, for the humiliation, for learning to breathe more quietly so as not to irritate him, for all the times I couldn't hang the towel on the wrong hook. A month later, Beatrice and I moved into our own apartment, small but bright, with windows overlooking a quiet street where passers-by walked their dogs in the mornings and the chirping of cicadas could be heard in the evenings. I chose it myself, without anyone's advice or reservations, signed the lease myself, paid the deposit myself. The apartment was old, a little dull, but it held the breath of freedom, the scent of fresh paint and new beginnings. I painted the walls, pale sand in the living room, soft green in the kitchen, and Beatrice helped me put up bird stickers, and it all felt like a game, almost a holiday, where every detail mattered. We chose wallpaper for her room, argued, laughed, reached out to each other over the ladder and rollers, getting dirty with paint, and I remember her saying, "Mom, I think this house is smiling," and I replied, "That's because it's happy we're here." It was our world, pure, still fragile, but real, devoid of control, judgment, cold glances, and suppressed sighs. There was an espresso machine in the kitchen, the very one I'd dreamed of for years, and now every morning I made myself a cup of coffee, listening to Beatrice hum in the shower. On the wall hung a recipe board, filled with my scrawl, not for order, but for pleasure. In the mornings, I'd go out to the balcony with a cup of tea and watch the sunlight slowly creep down the windowsill, filling the room with warmth. I was no longer afraid, no voices behind me, no sudden click of the lock, no question about "where did you go?" I was never afraid anymore. Filippo wrote occasionally, one letter, then another, then a short message. "I can't believe you actually wanted to break up the family, you got what you wanted. I hope this made you feel important." I read these words calmly, without the usual tremors, and erased them. Then another came, "One day Beatrice will know the truth," and I didn't answer, because Beatrice already knew the truth, not the one people tell, but the one they live. She saw me standing by the window in the night, breathing calmly for the first time in a long time. She knew what fear was, and what it meant when it was gone. One evening, we were baking cookies. I remember the flour swirling in the air, the sugar sticking to my fingers, her setting the timer and turning around to smile at me, the wide smile children give when, for the first time, they experience happiness not as a gift but as air. "Mom, cinnamon smells like home now," she said, and I froze for a moment, as if those words had entered me, settled in my heart, and then I answered, "That's because this is home, dear, just us, no screams, no drawn-out pauses when you can't breathe, no shadows in the hallway, just me and her. Our photos on the wall, from the sea, where the wind ruffles our hair, from the kitchen, where we have an upturned bowl of dough, and we both laugh, her magnets on the fridge, crooked clay hearts, our calendar, covered in felt-tip pen, 2 keys, hanging neatly on a hook by the door, not borrowed, not temporary, not handed out under supervision, ours. Recently, I received the last letter from my lawyer. All parties have fulfilled their obligations, the case is officially closed. I kept that letter not out of fear or anger, but as a reminder that I didn't run away, didn't give up, didn't hide behind someone's back. I stayed and persisted, and I left with my head held high, not as a victim, but as a person who was no longer a shadow in her own home. Filippo called for the last time on Thanksgiving. I saw his name on the screen, didn't flinch, just waited for the dial tone, pressed reject, and set my phone to silent. Then I returned to the kitchen, where cookies were cooling on the table and Beatrice was sitting in her star-patterned pajamas, drawing a bird, a big one, with its wings spread. Now I'm in no hurry anymore, not for doors, not for answers, not for explanations. I no longer hear the voices whispering that I'm nobody. My name is Sarah. I'm a mother, I'm the head of my family, I'm one of those who didn't fall apart. I stood up. It wasn't a victory, there was no triumph or applause, it was a restoration, a return of myself to myself, like an old house that had been washed of dust, repaired, and filled with light again. It wasn't revenge, it was justice, and now, quiet, calm, the way it only happens after a long storm, when the water stops rippling and reflects the sky without distortion. And now we're finally home. I don't know what you felt as you listened to this story, maybe anger, maybe sadness, or maybe that soft relief when you realize that everything that was supposed to end has finally ended, but I want to ask you, did Sarah do the right thing? Did she go too far, or did she simply, for the first time in her life, defend herself and her daughter in a way no one else could? If you recognize yourself in this story, if even one line touches you, speak up. After all, even the quietest voice, spoken out loud, can change an entire life.